Somewhere right now you are avoiding something. Maybe it is the email you have not replied to. Maybe it is the task that has been on your list for 11 days. Maybe you are just sitting there watching the ceiling, do nothing and feeling vaguely guilty about it. We call this boredom. We treat it like a malfunction, a gap in productivity that needs to be filled immediately with content or noise, or stimulation of any kind. But here's the thing nobody tells you about boredom. The most important inventions in human history were not born in busy rooms. They were not born in meetings or schedules or optimized productivity systems. They were born in exactly the state you are in right now. Empty time, restless hands, a mind with nowhere to go and nothing telling it what to do next. What ancient people did when they were bored did not just pass the time. It built the entire world you're living in. Let's go back, far back. Before electricity, before books, before any screen of any kind. You are a human being living somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 years ago. The hunt was this morning. The food is stored. The fire is lit. The sun is going down. And you have nothing to do. Nothing to do is not a modern problem. It is one of the oldest human experiences that exists. And what happened in those empty hours is one of the most consequential and least discussed stories in all of human history. The first thing ancient humans did when they were bored was make marks. Not for any practical reason, not because anyone asked them to, not because it served any immediate survival function. They picked up a piece of ochre or a burnt stick and they pressed it against a wall and they made a shape. An animal, a hand, a pattern that meant something only to them. The oldest known cave paintings are approximately 45,000 years old, found in caves in Indonesia and Spain and France, in places so deep and so dark that getting there required crawling through narrow passages carrying fire. Nobody accidentally stumbled into those caves and idly scribbled. Someone went there deliberately, with intention, with materials they prepared in advance, to make something that had no survival value whatsoever. That is what boredom looks like when it has nowhere to go but inward. It becomes art, and art became the first technology for transmitting human experience across time. Those paintings are not decoration. They are the first human attempt to say I was here. I saw this. This mattered. And it only happened because someone had empty time and restless hands. No. Netflix to fill the gap. Then came music. And this one is even older than the paintings. The oldest known musical instruments are bone flutes found in Germany and Slovenia dating back over 40,000 years. Someone took a vulture bone or a mammoth tusk and spent hours carving precise holes into it at precise intervals. Not because a flute keeps you warm, not because a flute catches animals, because the sound it made was interesting, and the silence was long, and human beings cannot tolerate silence for very long before they start trying to fill it with something beautiful. Music did something the cave paintings could not do. It synchronized people. When a group of humans makes rhythm together, their brainwaves actually begin to align. Their stress hormones drop. Their sense of belonging deepens. The bored human who invented music did not just create entertainment. They accidentally created the most powerful social bonding technology in human history, a technology we still use at every wedding, every funeral, every protest, every ceremony that matters. All of it came from boredom, from having nothing else to do. Then there is storytelling. And this is where things get genuinely strange. Somewhere around a fire tens of thousands of years ago, a person who had eaten enough and was warm enough and was safe enough looked at the people around them and started talking. Not about practical things. Not about where the water was or what the weather would do. They started making things up. They took real events and real people and real animals and they bent them into shapes that were not real. They exaggerated. They invented. They described things that had never happened as if they had. This is an extraordinary thing to do. No other animal does it. And it only happens in the gaps, in the spaces between the urgent and the necessary, in boredom. What storytelling did to the human brain is still being understood by neuroscience. But what we know is this: a story activates more of the brain than any other form of information transfer. Facts activate the language processing areas. Stories activate the sensory cortex, the motor cortex, the emotional centers, the memory systems. A story about running activates the same neural pathways as actually running. The bored ancient human who started telling stories around a fire was not just entertaining their tribe. They were building a shared simulation of reality that everyone in the group could inhabit simultaneously. That is how culture begins. That is how shared beliefs begin. That is how a group of unrelated individuals starts behaving like a single coordinated organism. Civilization is a story that enough people agreed to believe, and it started because someone around a fire had nothing else to do. But let us get more specific, because the history of boredom is full of specific moments that changed everything, and almost nobody knows about them. The ancient Mesopotamians invented writing around 5,000 years ago, and the first things they wrote were not poetry. They were not philosophy. They were not sacred texts. They were accounting records, grain counts, livestock tallies, tax records, deeply boring administrative documents that someone had to produce. Because running a civilization generates paperwork even before anyone has invented paper. But here's what happened next. Once you have a writing system, the bored scribes who mastered it started using it for other things. They started writing down the stories that had only ever been spoken. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written story in human history, was written down by scribes who had already done their official work and had clay tablets left over and hands that knew how to press symbols into wet earth. The first literature in human history was a side project. It was what someone did with the leftover time after the real work was done. The ancient Greeks took boredom to a completely different level. The Athenian citizens of the 5th century, BC did not work in the way we understand work. Slaves and foreigners handled most of the practical labor of the city. What this left the citizens with was an enormous amount of empty time and nowhere to put it. So they argued. They gathered in public spaces and debated everything. The nature of justice, the nature of beauty, what a good life looked like, whether the gods existed, whether the state had the right to tell you how to live. This was not productive. This was not efficient. By any measurable standard, it was a colossal waste of time for some of the most educated people in the ancient world. And out of that colossal waste of time came philosophy, logic, the foundations of Western science, the democratic experiment that all modern governments claim as their ancestor. Plato wrote his dialogues because he had time to think. Aristotle classified every living thing he could find because nobody was telling him to do something more useful. Socrates wandered the streets, asking uncomfortable questions because wandering the streets, asking uncomfortable questions was an option available to him in a city, wealthy enough to give its citizens free time. Boredom given to intelligent people with nothing urgent to do produces the longest lasting things in human history. Then there is the monastery. Medieval Europe between roughly 500 and 1400 AD monks, living in isolated communities under strict schedules of prayer and contemplation. And in the hours between the prayers there was silence. Long unbroken silence with nothing to fill it. What the monks did with that silence saved almost everything we know about the ancient world. They copied manuscripts, scrolls, books that existed in single fragile copies that would have disintegrated within decades without human intervention. Greek philosophy, Roman history, mathematical texts, medical knowledge, scientific observations, all of it passed through the bored, careful hands of monks who sat in cold rooms copying words they sometimes did not fully understand because the copying itself was a form of prayer and because there was nothing else to do in the long, quiet hours between devotions. The Renaissance happened in part because those copied manuscripts survived. The scientific revolution drew on ancient Greek texts that only existed because medieval monks had nothing else to do on a Tuesday afternoon. Boredom is not the enemy of civilization. It is one of its primary engines. Now here is what modern neuroscience has confirmed about all of this. When the brain is not actively engaged in a task, it does not go quiet. It activates what researchers call the default mode network, a system that becomes most active precisely when you are doing nothing, when you are daydreaming, when you are staring at the wall, when you are bored. The default mode network is associated with imagination, with future planning, with empathy, with the ability to understand other people's inner states, with creativity, with the kind of thinking that connects ideas across domains in ways that focused, directed attention never can. Every time you fill your boredom with a screen, you are interrupting that system before it can do its work. The ancient human who stared into the fire for an hour and then suddenly knew how to make a better tool was not wasting time. Their default mode network was running the most sophisticated problem-solving process available to the human brain. We have just built a world so full of stimulation that we never let it run anymore. The cave painter was bored. The bone flute carver was bored. The storyteller around the fire was bored. The scribe who wrote Gilgamesh was bored. Plato was bored. The monk copying Aristotle was bored. Every one of them did something with that boredom that outlasted them by thousands of years. You are sitting there with nothing to do. Your brain is trying to tell you something. The question is whether you will give it long enough to figure out what. The most important things humans have ever made were not made on a deadline. They were made in the gap, in the quiet, in the exact feeling you are trying to escape right now. Maybe stop escaping it